What do you get when a collapsing superpower runs out of tanks, out of ideas, and out of time? Apparently, you get this: Russia's so-called Dandelion tank. 4 years into what was supposed to be a lightning-fast conquest of Kyiv, Putin's once-feared war machine is now slapping steel rods on aging Soviet tanks and calling it innovation. This bizarre contraption, a T-72, T-80, or even a T-90M wrapped in welded metal florets, looks more like a scrap metal sculpture than battlefield tech. But behind the propaganda lies a harsher truth. Russia's arms industry is cracking, its doctrine is collapsing, and the Dandelion tank may be the most absurd symbol of that failure yet. So let's take a closer look at why this weird steel flower isn't just laughable, it's dangerous for Russia. First off, let's be clear about what we're looking at here. Russia has lost over 4,100 tanks in Ukraine, according to Oryx's visually confirmed data, a number that likely represents only a part of actual losses. That's on par with the armour destroyed during the Battle of Kursk in World War II, the clash that marked Nazi Germany's first decisive defeat on the Eastern Front. History doesn't repeat itself, but it certainly rhymes, and Putin's tanks are burning in roughly the same geographic area where Hitler's did 8 decades earlier. The Dandelion tank in question didn't just happen. It's the latest desperate iteration in Russia's increasingly absurd attempts to keep its armour alive long enough to matter. To understand how we got here, we need to look at the evolution of Russian tank protection, which reads less like military innovation and more like a comedy of errors with fatal consequences. But before we get deeper into this scrapyard Frankenstein of a war machine, if you're enjoying this breakdown, hit subscribe to The Military Show. We decode modern warfare for what it really is. No fluff, no filters, just facts. Now, back to the Dandelion. To understand how we got here, we need to look at the evolution of Russian tank protection, which reads less like military innovation and more like a comedy of errors with fatal consequences. It started with the beginnings of the Turtle tanks in mid-2023. Russian crews began by welding crude sheets of metal over their vehicles, creating makeshift roofs that theoretically would detonate incoming FPV drones before they struck vital components. The logic was simple. If Ukrainian drones were diving onto tank turrets from above, add another layer of metal for them to hit first. In practice, these modifications added significant weight while doing little to actually protect the tank. Furthermore, the sheet metal that was supposed to be a drone deterrent was thin enough that shaped charges could still penetrate it easily. Even worse, the tank's modified outline would also be more visible to enemy surveillance, much of which was supported by drones similar to kamikaze units. Ukrainian drone operators adapted within weeks, adjusting their attack angles or simply using more powerful warheads. By mid-2024, it was acknowledged that turtle tanks were nothing more than a fad that likely wouldn't be adapted to battlefields outside of Ukraine, and even there had little to no effect on Russia losing tanks. But before we go any further, we want to thank the sponsor of today's video, Private Internet Access, aka PIA, the world's most transparent VPN provider, trusted by over 30 million users worldwide. PIA is a leader in online privacy. Whenever you browse on an unprotected device, you're transmitting a great amount of information out into the open, which can be viewed by various different entities before reaching the website. VPN hides your IP address and encrypts your internet connection, shielding your data from your ISP, network administrators, and even government surveillance. Without a VPN, browsing online is a lot like sending a private message to a group chat. Everyone can see what you're doing. But with PIA, your activity is protected inside a secure, encrypted tunnel. Their no-logs policy has been proven multiple times in court and verified by an independent audit conducted by Deloitte, one of the world's leading auditing firms. Beyond security, PIA offers real freedom online, whether you're traveling abroad or just trying to access content not available in your region. PIA has you covered with servers in over 91 countries and all 50 US states. It also supports P2P file sharing and works with all major streaming services, so you can enjoy more content from anywhere. I personally use PIA while gaming to connect to local servers and reduce latency. It's also great for unlocking region-specific content across platforms like Netflix, Hulu, and more. PIA is available across all major platforms: Windows, macOS, Linux, iOS, Android, and more. And with just one subscription, you can protect an unlimited number of devices at the same time, perfect for securing your entire digital life. Right now, there's an exclusive offer for our viewers. Go to piavpn.com/themilitaryShow, also in the description, to get 83% off private internet access, bringing it down to just $2.03 a month. Plus, you'll receive 4 extra months completely free. And if you're still on the fence, they offer a 30-day money-back guarantee, and 24/7 customer support is always available to help. So go try private internet access right now. Your privacy deserves no less, and with PIA, you're in good hands. In late 2025 came the hedgehog tanks, covered in metal spikes and cables meant to entangle drone propellers or damage their sensors as they descended. Some versions wrapped the entire tank body in steel cables, like some kind of military cocoon. Others bristled with metal rods sticking out at odd angles, supposedly to snag incoming threats. The Russian Defense Ministry proudly displayed these vehicles, claiming they represented innovative battlefield adaptation. But the hedgehogs had the same fundamental problems as the turtles, only worse. The additional weight, which sometimes exceeded several tons, turned already sluggish tanks into crawling targets. These were T-72s and T-80s, which would ordinarily see widespread use in the field, despite hailing from the late stages of Soviet engineering. Worse for the hedgehog was the fact that some modifications could interfere with the tank's own defensive systems. The mess of wires could tangle into the turret, preventing it from rotating properly, or even blocking the hatch that was used to access or evacuate the vehicle. Ukrainian forces quickly learned that hedgehog tanks moved more slowly and had reduced situational awareness, making them easier to ambush with conventional anti-tank weapons. And in 2026, we have the Dandelion, or Adovanchik in Russian, which the Kremlin's Ministry of Defense recently patented with genuine pride. The design uses reinforced metal rods welded together to form a 3-dimensional barrier that branches out in multiple tiers, with high-strength mesh filling gaps between the florets. The entire structure resembles, well, a dandelion, if dandelions were made of steel and mounted on multi-million-dollar weapons platforms. The concept behind the Dandelion actually makes some tactical sense, at least on paper. When an FPV drone approaches the tank, it should ideally contact the outermost rods first, rather than reaching the armor directly. This forces the explosion to occur at a greater distance from the hull, theoretically reducing the blast's effectiveness. Against a swarm of drones in open terrain, the multiple branching layers could provide better survival rates by forcing Ukraine to expend more munitions per kill. If it takes a dozen drones to disable a standard tank, the Dandelion might require an additional dozen, buying Russia precious time to advance across open ground. And that's the key phrase, open ground. The Dandelion armor makes sense only in the specific scenario where Russian tanks are charging across fields towards Ukrainian defensive positions. This admittedly describes a significant portion of current Russian tactics. In these headlong rushes, crews can sacrifice some mobility and visibility for the chance to survive one more drone strike. When your strategic doctrine involves throwing armor at prepared defenses until something breaks through, any modification that extends vehicle lifespan by even a few minutes could be considered worthwhile. In theory, the Dandelion is an immediate evolution and improvement over the hedgehog mechanics. By distributing the pipes in a lattice rather than spreading a bunch of wires over the entirety of the tank still has an inkling of mobility and recognizability left. The design should supposedly be lighter and allow the tank to be more mobile than the predecessor, even if it's slower than the base tank. Furthermore, the design has also been applied to the T-90, Russia's current premier tank that's seeing active battlefield use in Ukraine. So there's the theory where Russia can use Dandelions to shuttle tanks across open fields and have them be slightly less vulnerable against Ukrainian drones. But as soon as those open fields end, the Dandelion's limitations become glaring. In urban combat, this design transforms from defensive innovation to catastrophic liability. And urban situations are something that Russia has historically been terrible at throughout the war in Ukraine. The city of Pokrovsk, for example, has been actively under siege since July 2024, and as of January 2026, the Ukrainian forces still report holding the northern part of the area and preventing Russia from completely consolidating its offensive. This is due to the inevitable downside of adding bulk and mass to a tank that was originally designed to be light and mobile. The metal scaffolding snags on building corners, power lines and debris, and the added mass makes it more difficult to maneuver or pick up speed. According to former British tank commander Colonel Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, Dandelion tanks are also unlikely to be able to snurdle, military slang for quietly maneuvering through woods and dead ground to achieve surprise. And while the Dandelion's design makes it more see-through than the previous options, it still entails adding a web around the tank. Modern tank warfare relies on sophisticated optics and sensors that allow crews to acquire targets at range and strike before being struck. The Dandelion's metal florets create blind spots throughout the commander's field of vision. Gunners struggle to track moving targets through the maze of steel rods. The tank's own defensive systems, including any electronic warfare equipment meant to jam drone signals, may have their effectiveness reduced by the metal cage interfering with signal propagation. Mobility-wise, some estimates suggest that the Dandelion structure adds several additional tons of steel. But tanks already burdened by previous modifications and often running on overtaxed engines due to poor maintenance, this extra mass pushes mechanical systems to their breaking point. And the added cage increases the vehicle's complexity, which can directly increase its maintenance demands. According to researchers from the Resurgam and Vyskovy Vyshchun platforms, who analyze satellite imagery of storage and repair facilities, Russian tank repair capacity has collapsed from over 120 vehicles per month in early 2022 to just 30 to 35 by early 2025. And here's the real kicker. The Dandelion cage might actually make Russian tanks easier to destroy, the exact opposite of its design intent. The vastly increased size and profile makes vehicles far more visible at a distance. Ukrainian reconnaissance drones can spot Dandelion tanks from farther away, giving anti-tank teams more time to prepare ambushes. The distinctive silhouette stands out even with camouflage attempts. Colonel de Bretton-Gordon suggested that marginal improvements against drones are likely going to be negated by making the tank a bigger, slower target for everything else in Ukraine's arsenal. And Ukraine has quite the arsenal these days. Beyond FPV drones, Ukrainian forces have accumulated thousands of anti-tank guided missiles from NATO suppliers, including Javelins, NLAWs and AT-4s. They've received modern main battle tanks that outclass Russian armour in nearly every category. They've developed their own drone swarm tactics that can overwhelm individual vehicle defences through sheer numbers. The Dandelion might stop the first few drones, but Ukrainian drone operators have shown remarkable adaptability. They're already sending entire swarms of drones from multiple angles, a tactic that can be modified literally on the fly to bypass physical armour changes. So, how effective is the Dandelion tank? Satellite imagery from late 2025 showed only a handful of Dandelion-equipped tanks, all stationary in warehouses or depot areas. There's no confirmed evidence yet of these vehicles seeing actual combat. When and if they do deploy, they'll likely achieve some initial success simply because Ukrainian forces haven't optimized their tactics against this specific configuration. This is supported by the simple fact that Ukraine also relies on using physical armor and netting as the preferred defensive option, even if it sacrifices a bit of mobility. If both militaries have had close to 4 years to iterate on designs and couldn't move beyond layering physical defenses, chances are it's one of the best solutions available. But that advantage will be temporary. Ukraine has consistently demonstrated the ability to analyze, adapt, and counter Russian innovations within weeks. The Turtle tanks achieved some early survivability gains before Ukrainian drone teams learned to target their weak points. The Hedgehog tanks similarly had a brief window of marginal effectiveness. The Dandelion will likely follow the same pattern. The broader context makes Russia's tank cage obsession even more desperate. According to the International Institute for Strategic Studies, Russia might not have sufficient main battle tanks to conduct effective offensive operations beyond early 2026 if it maintains the same operational tempo and suffers comparable losses. Russia began the war with approximately 3,300 tanks in active deployment and somewhere between 5,000 and 17,500 in storage, though many of those stored vehicles were in such poor condition that they could barely be considered functional. And as we pass into 2026, Russia has burned through the majority of its readily available armour. Tank loss rates have also gradually accelerated, despite there being fewer vehicles on the battlefield, a paradoxical situation explained by reduced armour density, making remaining tanks easier targets. Think of it like herd immunity in reverse. When you have fewer tanks providing overlapping defence and surveillance, each remaining vehicle becomes exponentially more vulnerable to coordinated drone attacks. And Russia's domestic production can't keep pace with these losses. Estimates suggest Russia can manufacture roughly 250 modernised tanks per year, including upgraded T-72s, T-80s and T-90s. Meanwhile, they're losing tanks at more than 3 times that rate. The production bottleneck gets worse when you account for refurbishment capacity. Russia started the war by pulling tanks in the best condition from storage, requiring minimal repairs. Now they're down to vehicles that have been sitting exposed to Siberian weather for decades, many missing critical components that were cannibalized years ago to keep other tanks running. Again, this is amplified by the fact that Russia has resorted to pulling museum pieces out of mothballs. T-62s appeared on the front lines in May 2022, shocking analysts who considered those tanks obsolete by any modern standard. By November 2024, Russia deployed actual T-34s, which were World War II era vehicles that belong in history textbooks. The sight of 80-year-old tanks being sent to fight against modern weapon systems tells you everything you need to know about Russia's equipment crisis. The Dandelion tank fits perfectly into this narrative of industrial desperation masquerading as innovation. It's not a technological breakthrough, it's not even particularly clever engineering. It's taking existing tanks that Russia can barely afford to lose and welding scrap metal onto them in the hope that the quantity of protective layers might somehow compensate for the quality of design. Russian military planners are essentially throwing steel at the problem and hoping physics works out in their favour. But here's what Russia has forgotten, or perhaps never learned. Tank design has always been about balancing 3 competing factors: firepower, the tank's ability to destroy threats; protection, the tank's ability to survive enemy fire; mobility, the tank's ability to maneuver effectively. The Dandelion tank undermines all 3 simultaneously. The T-90's formidable 125mm main gun is a lot less effective when the gunner can barely see through the metal cage to acquire targets. On the second front, the added scaffolding might make the tank slightly more effective against one specific threat, that being FPV drones, but it's completely unclear how that translates to conventional weapons. In traditional tank-to-tank combat, the one who shoots first often wins regardless of armor plating, as most tanks have armor-piercing ammunition that would make short work of a few added inches of metal. In this case, the reduced mobility and battlefield awareness will be the tank's Achilles heel. So let's dive into the crux of the problem. These developments are entirely brought about by the inherent differences in how Russia and Ukraine are trying to deal with each other's drone offensives. As you might guess, Russia is primarily using physical barriers, but Western militaries are addressing the drone threat through actual technological innovation. Britain, the United States, and other NATO members are developing electronic warfare systems that can jam drone signals, preventing them from reaching their targets in the first place. Active Protection Systems, or APS, can automatically detect and shoot down incoming threats, whether drones or anti-tank missiles, at a cost of just a few dollars per interception. Israel has used APS technology to excellent effect, and next-generation Western tanks will incorporate these systems as standard equipment. When you can defeat dozens of drones automatically without degrading your tank's other capabilities, you've solved the problem. When you weld metal flowers onto your turret and call it innovation, you've admitted defeat. The international response to the Dandelion tank has ranged from bewilderment to mockery. Some outlets believe that the tank will achieve some early success, but most agree that it's a slow spiral into irrelevance, much like with the previous designs. Even then, there are some serious lessons here beyond the absurdist spectacle. The Dandelion tank demonstrates how quickly modern warfare can render expensive weapons platforms obsolete. Drones costing a few $1,000s can threaten tanks worth millions, fundamentally altering the battlefield calculus. The military that adapts faster to this new reality, likely by spearheading new technological improvement, will dominate. Ukraine has learned this lesson better than any nation. Their drone warfare tactics have evolved from basic reconnaissance to sophisticated hunter-killer operations, from individual strikes to coordinated swarm attacks. They've created an entire industry around rapid drone development and deployment, iterating designs every few weeks based on battlefield feedback. Ukrainian forces have shown that innovation isn't about having the biggest defense budget or the most advanced starting technology. It's about relentless adaptation, creative problem solving, and the willingness to abandon approaches that don't work. Russia, meanwhile, keeps building bigger cages. The Dandelion tank is innovative only in the most superficial sense. Sure, the design is different and unusual, but if you squint a bit, you can still see the original turtle tank peeking through with all of its mobility problems. And when you compare it with the hedgehog, the differences seem even smaller. And the design is only a partial solution at best. You see, a tank was never actually meant to be invulnerable to drones. It's not something that was built into the platform. And both Ukraine and Russia have determined quite early on that tanks alone are unlikely to actually win the war. But the bigger problem is that Russia doesn't seem to want to acknowledge that fact. Instead, it's still throwing equipment with some modifications to the front line, all the while bleeding personnel that it can't replace. The Dandelion tank won't change that reality. It might buy Russia a few more months of offensive capability, a few more miles of devastated Ukrainian territory, but it won't reverse the trajectory of a war that's hollowing out Russia's military capacity and destroying its economic future. When historians look back at this conflict, the Dandelion tank will likely become a symbol, joining the turtle and hedgehog in the gallery of desperate measures that characterize Russia's final years as a military superpower. It'll serve as a reminder that in modern warfare, there's no substitute for genuine technological innovation, adaptive tactics, and a military doctrine grounded in reality rather than propaganda. The creators of the legendary T-34, the tank that helped defeat Nazi Germany and establish Soviet armored doctrine for generations, would be horrified to see their legacy reduced to this. The T-34 succeeded because it balanced firepower, protection, and mobility better than its opponents. It could be mass-produced, easily maintained, and effectively deployed by crews with minimal training. It embodied the principles of good tank design that Russia has now abandoned in favor of improvised metal sculptures that fail at every fundamental level. So yes, the Dandelion tank is absurd. It's also tragic, revealing, and ultimately instructive. It shows us what happens when military necessity collides with industrial incapability, when propaganda demands solutions that engineering cannot provide. When a nation's leadership commits to a war, it fundamentally cannot win. The Dandelion tank is Putin's war machine in miniature, desperate, ineffective, and doomed. Thanks for watching. Now, to understand how Ukraine is trying to win without tanks, check out our analysis on a novel robot army that it plans to raise in the coming years. And if you want to stay current with the evolution of modern warfare and the tactics reshaping 21st century combat, subscribe to The Military Show for daily videos.